Police Chief Robert Hayes stood at his office window on the third floor of the Millbrook Police Department, watching the early morning sun cast long shadows across the empty parking lot. His polished badge caught the light, reflecting his 25 years of carefully cultivated authority in this Arizona town. At 53, Hayes had mastered the art of maintaining control through a delicate balance of charm and intimidation. The autumn morning carried on like any other. Hayes performed his usual ritual of adjusting the collection of framed accolades on his wall: certificates of excellence, newspaper clippings praising his leadership, and photos of handshakes with various state officials. Each piece carefully chosen to reinforce his image of respectability. His secretary, Linda Martinez, knocked twice before entering with his morning coffee and mail. "Chief, there's a certified envelope that needs your immediate attention," she said, placing a thick manila package on his desk. Hayes noticed her lingering concern but dismissed it with a wave. The return address caught his attention: 1542 Saguaro Lane, the newly developed area of town where several affluent families had recently settled. Hayes remembered approving the construction permits himself, ensuring the right people got the right contracts. He sliced open the envelope with his silver letter opener, a retirement gift from his predecessor. As he spread the contents across his mahogany desk, his practiced smile faded. Inside were meticulously organized documents, spreadsheets detailing traffic stop statistics, cross-referenced incident reports, and statements from residents of Oak Hill District. Each page revealed patterns that Hayes had spent years ensuring remained invisible. The accompanying letter bore a signature that made his coffee turn bitter in his mouth: Catherine Bennett. The name was unfamiliar, but the tone was unmistakable. This was someone who knew how to navigate bureaucracy, someone who understood the power of documented evidence. Hayes pressed the intercom. "Linda, get me everything we have on a Catherine Bennett. Recent move in Saguaro Lane area." While waiting, he reviewed more of the documents, his unease growing with each page. The reports detailed specific incidents, dates, and officer names. Some of these cases he remembered personally orchestrating. Within 30 minutes, Linda returned with a surprisingly thin file. "Sir, she's only been here 3 months. Bought the corner property on Saguaro Lane cash. No local employment records, minimal social media presence. She's been seen at the library frequently, requesting public records." Hayes stood up, straightening his uniform more out of habit than necessity. Through his window, he could see Oak Hill District in the distance, its modest homes a sharp contrast to the gleaming new developments on the other side of town. He'd spent years ensuring these two worlds remained separate, managing the delicate balance that kept Millbrook running according to his vision. His desk phone rang, the private line only known to a select few. The caller ID showed Deputy Miller, his most trusted officer. "Chief, we might have a situation. That traffic stop program you implemented last month. Someone's been documenting everything. They're asking questions of the courthouse." Hayes felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with challenge, but also a flicker of genuine concern. This wasn't a typical complaint from a disgruntled citizen. The methodical nature of the documentation, the professional tone of the letter, the strategic gathering of evidence. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He looked again at Catherine Bennett's signature, studying its confident strokes. In all his years of maintaining control, he learned that threats needed to be handled early before they could take root. This ordinary Tuesday had just become anything but ordinary. "Miller," he said into the phone, his voice steady despite his rising tension, "meet me at Copper Creek Diner in 20 minutes. Use the back entrance." He placed the documents back in their envelope, his mind already formulating plans. Catherine Bennett had just made herself a priority, and Robert Hayes had never been one to ignore a potential threat to his authority. The Copper Creek Diner sat on the outskirts of Millbrook, its neon sign flickering weakly in the late morning sun. Chief Hayes chose his usual booth in the back corner, positioned perfectly to watch both entrances while remaining hidden from the parking lot. The worn leather seats and faded desert landscapes on the walls had witnessed countless private conversations over the years. Deputy James Miller arrived precisely on time, his casual clothes a deliberate choice to avoid attention. At 38, Miller represented everything Hayes valued in an officer: ambitious enough to be useful, but compromised enough to be controllable. The deputy's gambling debts from 5 years ago had proven to be a particularly valuable investment for Hayes. "Coffee, black, and keep it coming," Hayes told Ruby, the longtime waitress who knew better than to linger near his table. He waited until she was well out of earshot before spreading Bennett's documents across the table. "This arrived this morning," Hayes said, his voice low despite the empty diner. "Someone's been watching us, James. Every traffic stop, every random inspection, every little program we've implemented in Oak Hill. All documented, cross-referenced, and tied together with a neat little bow." Miller's face paled as he recognized his own name in several reports. How did they get this level of detail? These patterns? They'd need access to internal records to make these connections. Hayes stirred his coffee methodically, the silver spoon clinking against porcelain in perfect rhythm. "Our new resident, Catherine Bennett, seems to have a talent for research. 3 months in town, and she's already compiled enough to start asking uncomfortable questions. Want me to have a talk with her?" Miller's hand instinctively moved toward where his service weapon would normally rest. Hayes shook his head. "No, this requires finesse. She's smart, methodical. Direct intimidation would only give her more ammunition." He pulled out a fresh notepad, his pen hovering over the blank page. "We need to change the narrative." For the next hour, they crafted their plan. Hayes sketched out a timeline, drawing from years of experience in manipulating evidence and public perception. They would start small: a few suspicious transactions in Bennett's name, carefully placed rumors about late-night meetings, anonymous tips about unusual activities at her house. "The beauty of it," Hayes explained, drawing arrows between different points on his notepad, "is that we'll use her own thoroughness against her. She likes documentation. We'll give her documentation. By the time we're done, she'll have a paper trail that would make Al Capone nervous." Miller nodded, but anxiety crept into his voice. "What about internal affairs, after last year's incident?" "Internal affairs," Hayes interrupted, "sees what we want them to see. Remember the Thompson case? By the time we're done, any investigation into us will lead straight to her doorstep. Create enough smoke, and everyone will assume there's fire." Ruby approached with a fresh pot of coffee, and both men fell silent. Hayes watched her retreat, reminded of how many conversations in this booth had reshaped Millbrook's history. The diner's indoor cameras had been malfunctioning for years, another small detail he'd arranged long ago. "Start with the financial angles," Hayes continued, pushing a list toward Miller. "Set up the accounts today. Use the contacts in Phoenix. They know how to backdate transactions. I want a pattern establishing itself by the end of the week. Nothing too obvious, just enough to raise flags when someone starts looking." Miller tucked the list into his jacket pocket, his nervousness now replaced with familiar determination. "And the surveillance? Already arranged. Teams in place by tonight. Everything by the book, proper warrants, documented reasonable suspicion. When this all comes to light, every piece needs to look perfect." Hayes gathered the documents, his movements precise and controlled. "Catherine Bennett thinks she's found a pattern. We'll give her a masterpiece." As they prepared to leave, Hayes caught his reflection in the diner's window. For a moment, he saw what others saw: the respected police chief, the pillar of the community. He straightened his civilian jacket, already anticipating his next moves. Catherine Bennett had unwittingly stepped into a game he'd been playing since before she got her first library card, and he intended to remind her why nobody challenged the status quo in Millbrook. The operation began with surgical precision 3 days after the diner meeting. Chief Hayes stood in his darkened office, watching the unmarked police car slip quietly into position near Catherine Bennett's house. The digital clock on his desk read 2:47 a.m., and the streets of Millbrook's upscale Saguaro Lane lay silent under the desert moon. Through his encrypted radio, Hayes listened to Miller coordinate the night's activities. "Packages in position," Miller's voice crackled. Turner's team is ready with the cameras. They'd chosen this night carefully. Bennett had a documented pattern of late-night research at the library on Wednesdays, usually returning home after midnight. Hayes picked up his binoculars, focusing on Bennett's elegant two-story home. The landscaping was still new, palm trees barely taller than a man, offering little coverage but also little interference. He watched as shadows moved precisely according to plan. Officers in plain clothes, each movement choreographed to appear random to any casual observer. "Sir," Miller's voice returned, first phase complete. "Systems show successful integration." Hayes allowed himself a small smile. The sophisticated monitoring equipment they'd just installed would create a perfect digital trail, all leading back to Bennett. Every incoming and outgoing signal from her home would now pass through their filters, creating patterns that would later prove invaluable. The next morning, Hayes arrived at the station earlier than usual, nodding to the desk surgeon as he passed. In his office, Linda had already placed the morning reports on his desk, including the first pieces of their manufactured evidence. The falsified bank records looked flawless, a series of small transactions, each just under reporting thresholds, flowing through accounts that would eventually link back to Bennett's address. "Linda," he called through the intercom, "get me Officer Peterson." Minutes later, a young officer appeared, eager to prove himself. "Peterson, I need you to follow up on some anonymous tips we've received." "Standard procedure, nothing urgent." Hayes handed him a carefully prepared list of local businesses. Each one would independently confirm suspicious activities, thanks to Hayes's network of cooperative owners who owed him favors. By noon, the pieces were falling into place. Hayes sat in the station's break room, pretending to read the newspaper while listening to officers discuss the latest rumors about the new resident on Saguaro Lane. The whispers spread exactly as planned, not too fast, not too dramatic, just enough to plant seeds of doubt. Later that afternoon, Hayes drove past Bennett's house, noting with satisfaction the unmarked car parked 2 houses down. The surveillance team had established a rotation pattern that would appear routine to any observer. As he passed, he caught a glimpse of Bennett in her front window, working at her desk, unaware of the web tightening around her. Everything in place at the courthouse. Hayes spoke into his secure phone, checking in with his contact in the records department. "All set, Chief," came the response. "Documents are filed and backdated. Anyone checking will find a pattern going back 6 months before she even moved here. County records match perfectly." Hayes ended the call satisfied. They'd created layers of evidence: digital, paper, testimonial, each supporting the others, each seemingly independent but all telling the same story. His years of building relationships, collecting favors, and understanding the system's weaknesses were paying off. That evening, Hayes received the first surveillance photos. Bennett at various locations around town, each image carefully selected to appear suspicious when viewed in the right context. The timestamp on one photo showed her meeting with a known local character Hayes had paid to be there, a perfect detail for later investigation. As darkness fell over Millbrook, Hayes stood again at his office window. From this vantage point, he could see the lights of both Oak Hill and Saguaro Lane, 2 worlds he'd kept separate for so long. Tomorrow, more pieces would fall into place. More evidence would appear, more whispers would spread, more threads would weave together to create an unbreakable net. The night shift radio crackled with routine updates, and Hayes felt the familiar satisfaction of being in complete control. Catherine Bennett's investigation into his department was about to become the least of her concerns. Soon, she'd be too busy defending herself to worry about traffic stop patterns in Oak Hill. The Desert Pines Golf Club sparkled under the Arizona sun as Chief Hayes lined up his putt on the 18th hole. He just finished playing the back 9 with State Senator Williams, carefully losing by 3 strokes. The morning had gone perfectly. Casual conversation about upcoming budget allocations, subtle hints about department needs, and a friendly wager that would ensure the senator remembered their game fondly. Hayes checked his phone between holes, noting with satisfaction the updates from Miller about their operation. The evidence against Bennett was accumulating beautifully. 3 separate bank accounts now showed suspicious patterns. Local businesses had logged questionable interactions, and the surveillance photos painted an increasingly compelling picture. "Beautiful day for golf," Senator Williams commented, sinking a short putt. "Shame about those rumors I'm hearing about your town, Rob. Something about potential federal interest." Hayes kept his expression neutral as he retrieved his ball. "Nothing to worry about, Senator. Just a local matter we're wrapping up. You know how these things go. Someone new comes to town, starts making noise, then realizes they've misunderstood the situation." His phone buzzed again. Miller's name flashed on the screen, marked urgent. Hayes excused himself, walking toward his golf cart for privacy. "This better be important, James. I'm with the senator." The panic in Miller's voice cut through the static. "Chief, we have a serious problem. Anderson from Records just called. He was double-checking the background details we planted, and, sir, you need to hear this." Hayes felt a slight tightening in his chest. "Spit it out, James." "Catherine Bennett isn't just Catherine Bennett. She's federal judge Catherine Bennett Rodriguez. She's been working out of the Phoenix courthouse under her married name. That's why we didn't make the connection immediately. She's not just some random new resident. She's been appointed to oversee the upcoming Marshall case." The golf club slipped from Hayes' fingers, landing soundlessly on the manicured grass. The Marshall case, a major corruption investigation that had been making waves across 3 states. He'd been following it in the news, thankful it had nothing to do with Millbrook. "There's more," Miller continued, his voice shaking. "The Marshall case. It's expanded. Judge Bennett Rodriguez has been quietly building a larger investigation into law enforcement practices across the region. Our district is part of it. She moved to Millbrook deliberately, sir. She's been gathering evidence for months." Hayes stared across the golf course, seeing nothing. His mind raced through every document they'd falsified, every system they'd tampered with, every person they'd involved in their scheme. Each careful step they'd taken to frame Bennett now read like a confession of their own crimes. "The surveillance team we sent last night," Miller's voice dropped even lower. "They reported she had a federal security detail. They've been watching us watch her. Everything we've done, the bank records, the fake tips, the surveillance, it's all documented. We didn't just walk into her investigation, sir. We jumped right into the middle of it." Senator Williams called out something about the next hole, but Hayes barely heard him. His perfect morning shattered as implications cascaded through his mind. A federal judge. They'd tried to frame a federal judge. "Get everyone involved into my office," Hayes ordered, his voice tight. "No phones, no emails. And Miller, get rid of everything from the diner meeting. Everything." He ended the call, turning to see Senator Williams approaching with a concerned expression. "Everything all right, Rob? You look like you've seen a ghost." Hayes forced a smile, years of practice keeping his voice steady. "Just a small situation at the station, Senator. Nothing to worry about." But as they walked to the next hole, Hayes felt the carefully constructed pillars of his world beginning to tremble. His phone buzzed again. Another update from the surveillance team. Judge Bennett Rodriguez was leaving her house, heading toward the federal building in Phoenix. The same building where all their falsified evidence had been filed. The same building where his carefully placed contacts were already under investigation. The Arizona sun suddenly felt much hotter on the back of his neck. The clock on Hayes' office wall ticked past midnight, each sound echoing through the empty police station. Paper shredder humming steadily, he fed another stack of documents into its metal teeth. The basement lights cast harsh shadows across decades of carefully maintained records, now being systematically destroyed. His phone lit up again, the 20th unanswered call from Miller. Hayes glanced at the screen before silencing it. The last conversation with his deputy had ended in a shouting match, with Miller threatening to cut a deal to save himself. Loyalty, Hayes was learning, had its limits. "Sir." Linda's unexpected voice made him jump. She stood in the doorway, still wearing her day clothes despite the late hour. "I thought you should know. There are 2 news vans parked outside the station." Hayes moved to his window. Sure enough, Channel 12 and the local newspaper had set up camp in the parking lot. Who talked? He demanded, though he already knew the answer. Too many people involved, too many weak links in his chain of command. His computer chimed with a new email. The sender's address made his blood run cold. Office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The subject line was simple. Notice of investigation. Immediate response required. Linda, Hayes said, trying to keep his voice steady, get me Judge Harrison on the phone. And then Mayor Phillips. Both men owed him favors, substantial ones. He'd saved Harrison's son from a DUI charge last year, and the mayor's real estate dealings wouldn't hold up under serious scrutiny. I'm sorry, sir, Linda replied, her voice carefully neutral. Judge Harrison's office says he's unavailable for the foreseeable future. And Mayor Phillips, his secretary, says he's in emergency meetings all day tomorrow. The message was clear. His allies were abandoning ship. Hayes loosened his tie, feeling the weight of 30 years of careful manipulation crashing down around him. On his desk, photographs from the surveillance operation lay scattered, each one now looking less like evidence against Bennett and more like proof of his own corruption. His secure phone buzzed, the one only 5 people had the number for. The message was from his contact at the courthouse. Federal agents just left with boxes of records. They're looking at everything from the past decade. Hayes sank into his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. A decade of records meant the Thompson case would surface, and the Martinez incident, and the Oak Hill property rezoning deals. Each decision, each careful manipulation that had seemed necessary at the time, now formed links in a chain that would drag him under. Looking through his office window, he could see more cars arriving at the station. FBI vehicles, unmarked but unmistakable. They moved with practiced efficiency, securing exits, establishing a perimeter. This wasn't a surprise visit. They'd been preparing this operation while he was busy orchestrating his failed frame-up. Chief, Linda appeared again. Agent Marcus is here with a warrant. They're requesting access to the records room and your office computers. Hayes looked at his half-finished shredding job, knowing it was too late. They'd have digital copies of everything already. Judge Bennett Rodriguez would have made sure of that before they made their move. His phone lit up with a text from his wife. News says FBI at station. What's happening? Call me. The sound of multiple footsteps echoed up the stairs. Hayes straightened his uniform one last time, a habit of decades. Through the window, he could see camera crews setting up lights, preparing for the money shot, the police chief's walk of shame. Linda stepped aside as Agent Marcus entered, flanked by 2 other agents. Chief Robert Hayes, Marcus began, his tone formal but carrying an edge of satisfaction. We have some questions about your department's recent surveillance activities. Hayes looked past them to where Judge Bennett Rodriguez stood in the hallway, calm and professional in her federal judge's attire. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw not triumph or anger, but something worse, the steady gaze of justice finally catching up to him. The federal building's chambers felt colder than Hayes remembered from his previous visits. Now, sitting across from Judge Bennett Rodriguez, he noticed details he'd missed during his confident strolls through these halls: the reinforced windows, the subtle security cameras, the silent panic button beneath her desk. Please, take a seat, Chief Hayes, Judge Bennett Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the weight of authority without a hint of the satisfaction he'd expected. She looked different in her judicial robes, somehow both younger and more formidable than the woman he'd been surveilling. Hayes adjusted his tie, aware that his uniform, usually a source of power, now felt like a costume. Your Honor, I can explain the recent surveillance operation. There were legitimate concerns about. Chief, she interrupted, opening a leather portfolio on her desk. Let's not waste each other's time with stories we both know aren't true. She pressed a button on her desk phone. Send them in, please. 2 FBI agents entered, carrying boxes of documents. Hayes recognized his own handwriting on some of the folders, records he thought had been shredded days ago. His stomach tightened as he realized these weren't copies. They were the originals. You see, Robert, may I call you Robert? While you were busy creating your elaborate frame-up, we were documenting everything. Every falsified record, every planted piece of evidence, every illegal surveillance operation. She spread photographs across her desk. Hayes at the Copper Creek Diner with Miller, the surveillance team installing equipment, the midnight meetings with local business owners. Your own cameras caught most of it, she continued, turning a laptop screen toward him. The ones you installed in Oak Hill. They didn't just record the residents. They recorded your officers planting evidence, conducting illegal searches, creating the very problems you claimed to be solving. Hayes felt sweat gathering at his collar. Those cameras were for public safety. Every operation was approved through proper channels. Like this channel. She pulled out his notepad from the diner meeting, the one he thought Miller had destroyed. Your deputy was quite cooperative once we showed him what we had. Turns out, a gambling addiction makes people nervous about federal charges. The judge stood, walking to her window that overlooked the city. You know what interested me most, Robert? Not the corruption. Sadly, that's not uncommon. It was your efficiency. You built such a perfect system of control that it almost seemed legitimate. Almost. She returned to her desk, pressing another button. A recording played. Hayes' own voice giving orders about traffic stops in Oak Hill, about property seizures, about which residents to target. We have 17 years of similar recordings, she said quietly. Your predecessor wasn't as careful about data storage as he thought. When we began investigating the Marshall case, we had no idea it would lead us to Millbrook, but patterns have a way of revealing themselves to patient observers. Hayes felt the last threads of his control slipping away. What do you want? Want? Judge Bennett Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. This isn't a negotiation, Chief Hayes. This is a courtesy meeting before the formal charges are filed. I believed you deserved to hear it directly, given your attention to my activities these past weeks. She slid a document across the desk, a detailed list of federal charges that seemed to go on forever. Hayes scanned it, recognizing each incident, each decision that had seemed reasonable at the time. You'll be formally arrested this afternoon, she said, her tone professional but not unkind. I suggest you contact your attorney immediately. And Robert? She waited until he met her gaze. The next time you decide to investigate someone, perhaps start with their full name. Hayes stood, his legs unsteady. At the door, he paused. Why move to Millbrook? Why not just send in the FBI? Because, she replied, already focusing on her next case file, sometimes justice needs to see things from ground level. Your officers taught me that, even if they didn't realize they were teaching. The early morning sun hadn't yet touched the Millbrook police station when the news broke. National media crews lined the street 3 deep, their satellite vans creating a maze of cables and equipment. Reporter Jessica Chen from CNN stood front and center, her voice carrying over the growing crowd. In a shocking development, Millbrook Police Chief Robert Hayes faces multiple federal charges in what prosecutors are calling one of the most extensive cases of systematic law enforcement corruption in recent history. Sources say the investigation began as part of the broader Marshall case but quickly expanded. Inside his home, Hayes watched the coverage on mute, his phone buzzing constantly with messages he no longer bothered to check. His wife had taken their daughter to her sister's house in Phoenix, leaving behind a note that said simply, "How could you?" The doorbell rang, another reporter, probably. But when Hayes peered through the blinds, he saw Andrew Thompson standing on his porch. Thompson, whose family had lost their restaurant 5 years ago after Hayes' department had fabricated health code violations to make way for a developer's project. More cars were pulling up to his house. Hayes recognized faces he tried to forget. The Martinez family, elderly Mrs. Chen from the corner store, former officer Sarah Rodriguez, who'd been forced to resign after threatening to report misconduct. Each person carried a story he hoped would stay buried. His secure phone, the one that had once connected him to power players across the state, chirped with its first message in days. From Senator Williams. Committee meeting concluded. Your pension has been suspended pending investigation. The TV switched to live coverage from the federal courthouse, where Judge Bennett Rodriguez was making a statement. Hayes turned up the volume. This investigation has revealed not just individual acts of misconduct, but a carefully constructed system designed to manipulate law enforcement for personal gain and power. The evidence suggests that over nearly 2 decades, Chief Hayes and several co-conspirators created an intricate network of corruption that touched every aspect of Millbrook's civic life. The camera panned to show Miller being led into the courthouse, no longer in uniform, his face ashen. Behind him, 3 local business owners Hayes had relied on for years walked with their lawyers, heads down, rushing past the media gauntlet. Hayes' laptop pinged with an email notification. The local newspaper had published its investigation, a massive digital archive of every incident, every complaint, every suspicious pattern they'd uncovered. The reporters had been sitting on this for weeks, coordinating with federal authorities to avoid compromising the investigation. His daughter's text landed like a physical blow. "My friend's parents are talking about you on Facebook. Is it true what they're saying about the Thompson family?" Outside, the crowd at his house had grown. News crews filmed as people shared stories with reporters. Tales of selective enforcement, of mysterious property seizures, of careers and lives derailed by Hayes' calculated interventions. Each account added another piece to the puzzle Judge Bennett Rodriguez had assembled. The mayor held an emergency press conference on the steps of City Hall. "In light of these disturbing revelations, I am announcing an immediate external audit of all department operations. Furthermore, we are establishing an independent commission to review every case handled under Chief Hayes' administration." Hayes' lawyer called, his voice tense. "They've frozen your accounts. All of them. Even the ones in Arizona City. They found those too." On TV, legal experts dissected his probable defense strategies while prosecutors outlined the charges: wire fraud, civil rights violations, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. The list scrolled endlessly across the screen. Former allies scattered like leaves in a storm. The same business owners who'd benefited from his protection now claimed they'd been coerced. Officers who'd followed his orders suddenly remembered their moral objections. Even Linda had provided a detailed statement about documents she'd been instructed to alter over the years. Hayes stared at his reflection in the blank TV screen as the sun finally crested the horizon. The man who had controlled Millbrook with such precision for so long now sat powerless, watching his carefully constructed world dissolve in the harsh light of justice. 6 months later, autumn painted Millbrook streets in golden light as Judge Catherine Bennett Rodriguez walked through Oak Hill. She paused at the corner where new street signs had replaced the old, no longer faded and forgotten, but bright and clear like every other neighborhood in town. Inside the renovated community center, formerly an abandoned building Hayes had kept tied up in zoning disputes, she found a packed house. Residents filled every seat, some standing along the walls, as the new police chief presented the department's quarterly transparency report. "Our complaint resolution rate has improved by 60%, Chief Maria Santos explained, pointing to clear charts. "Every traffic stop, every citation, every interaction is now documented with body camera footage and reviewed by our Civilian Oversight Board." Bennett Rodriguez smiled, remembering the resistance to these changes just months ago. But that was before Hayes' guilty plea had shaken the foundations of Arizona law enforcement. His detailed confession, part of a deal to avoid a life sentence, had exposed corruption networks across 3 states. Her phone buzzed. A message from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The Thompson family's civil suit had been settled. They would not only recover their restaurant, but receive compensation for years of lost business. Similar settlements were processing for dozens of other families affected by Hayes' actions. After the meeting, she walked to the newly established Office of Public Accountability, housed in what used to be Hayes' private conference room at the station. Through the window, she could see citizens reviewing body camera footage, filing reports, and engaging with officers in a way that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "Your Honor," called Sarah Rodriguez, now reinstated as a lieutenant and head of the department's new Internal Affairs Division. We finished reviewing the last batch of Hayes-era cases. 28 more convictions overturned, all from Oak Hill arrests. The judge nodded, thinking of the lives impacted by each number. The department's evidence room had revealed hundreds of files Hayes had marked closed, each one containing stories of justice delayed but finally not denied. At the federal courthouse, a wall of photos told the story of change. Hayes in handcuffs, Miller signing his plea agreement, corrupt business owners being sentenced. But more importantly, it showed images of reform, new training programs, community oversight meetings, joint task forces between local and federal agencies. Bennett Rodriguez entered her chambers, where a stack of letters awaited her daily review. Not complaints now, but updates from other jurisdictions implementing what had become known as the Millbrook model of police reform. Her quiet investigation had sparked a movement that stretched far beyond Arizona's borders. The evening news played quietly in the background as she worked. Hayes' face appeared briefly. He was serving his 15-year sentence in a federal facility in Colorado, his empire of influence now reduced to a 6-by-8 cell. The story quickly shifted to coverage of Millbrook's transformation, showing statistics of improved response times, reduced complaints, and increased public trust. Outside her window, she could see pairs of officers walking their beats. Each team now deliberately mixed, partnering veterans with newcomers, building bridges between the department and the community it served. The us versus them mentality that Hayes had cultivated for decades was gradually being replaced by a spirit of genuine public service. Her last task of the day was signing off on the final report about the Hayes investigation. The document would become part of law enforcement training programs nationwide, a case study in how corruption takes root, and more importantly, how it can be exposed and eliminated. As she drove home along Saguaro Lane, Bennett Rodriguez passed the spot where Hayes' surveillance team had once watched her house. Now, children played freely in front yards while their parents chatted on porches. The invisible barriers between neighborhoods had dissolved, replaced by a growing sense of community unity. Her phone lit up with a final message. The governor had just signed the Police Accountability Act, incorporating many of the reforms tested in Millbrook. What had started as one judge's careful investigation had grown into a blueprint for change, proving that justice, though sometimes slow, moves with unstoppable purpose when guided by determined hands.